Sochi, when you see those numbers, do they surprise you?
Well, Democrats know that they need to do better with young voters. That's always been the case, and we've always found ways to try to engage them. If you break up some of the numbers, what you're seeing is that President Biden does well with those younger college-educated voters. Where he needs to do better, and where Democrats need to do better, is with the non-college educated younger voters. And a lot of the data that you just showed on your screen right now could be improved by passing bills like Build Back Better. Younger voters don't want to see the gridlock in Washington. They might not be paying attention to the day-to-day, but they do know that Washington is dysfunctional. And so what the Biden administration and Democrats need to do is show how they're delivering on climate change, how they're putting more money in their pocket. How are we getting over this pandemic? All of these things can be passed through legislation and different policies that the Biden administration is currently pushing.
So here's the thing, I think, Santiago, whenever I see those numbers, and I know Sochi is with me, which is it's a midterm year. You talk about young voters. There's always someone who sort of groans and says, why are we talking about them? They're not going to show up. Stop talking about them. Well, this is part of why we have to talk about them, because we have to invite them into the conversation. We have to make them a part of the conversation so that there are resources, so that there are efforts to actually engaging them, to understanding things like that college differential. Santiago, I'm going to guess you were in a lot of meetings where you were asked, if poll numbers look like that, why do you think we shouldn't be investing? What is the case that you make?
Yes, absolutely. I think the biggest issue with young voters right now is that there is simply a lack of messaging for them. And that is something that we've seen in our own research with Voters of Tomorrow. The biggest issue is that young voters simply do not understand what's inside of the bills that are currently being debated. So, for example, with Build Back Better, there is a lot of parts of the bill that are catered directly towards young voters. There is a lot of climate change legislation. There is a lot of education components. But in our research, we figured that people simply do not understand what is in there. And it correlates with a lot of mistrust in the Biden administration and in congressional Democrats. And that is something that they need to fix really quickly if they want young voters to support them in the midterms.
Can I ask you, though, Santiago, is that a mistrust specifically? When we say it's a mistrust of the Biden administration or it's a mistrust of Democrats in Congress, is it a mistrust in them specifically as individuals, or is it a mistrust of the system writ large?
It is a mistrust in government, really. And the biggest issue with young voters is that they do not feel listened to. So that is a big part of why we're asking the Biden administration and why we're asking congressional Democrats to really give a voice to young voters and to Gen Z. We have been asking for months to the Biden administration to establish a White House Youth Advisory Board that would bring Gen Z and millennial activists inside the White House and listen to what their priorities are. Honestly, it is kind of hard for us, a relatively older president, to understand what's affecting young voters without listening to them. So that's what we've been asking them to do and what we're going to keep pushing them to do until midterms.
Sochi, do you remember when we were young voters and we would have this conversation as young voters ourselves instead of people who were once young voters talking about them? Listen, there's this piece about how you message that is, of course, critical. There is this piece about delivering legislation. Sochi, the other thing we know is that a lot of this comes down to access, to how easy it is to vote, to how accessible voting is. And so as we have this conversation about voting rights in this country, one of the groups we need to be most concerned about is young Americans.
You're absolutely right, Alicia. And you've seen states like Texas and Georgia and others that are trying to pass voter suppression laws because they understand that if Democrats can't turn out young voters and minority voters, that Republicans will win. And that is why you've seen Chuck Schumer and the president and the Democratic leadership come out and say, wait a minute, at the beginning of this year, we are going to tackle voting rights, because they understand if they don't restore the Voting Rights Act, if they don't put measures in place to stop these voter suppression laws, then Democrats aren't going to win, and therefore Democrats can't make progress for the American people. So you're going to see a big push at the start of the year because of those young voters, because of those minority voters, and the Republicans will continue to attempt to try to silence them.
So, Santiago, we've talked about Build Back Better. We have talked about voting rights. I also want to make sure that we talk about student debt, which, of course, is an issue to the American economy at large, often gets painted as a young person issue. I think we can all understand that there are multiple generations at this point that are saddled with an unprecedented level of student debt. Is that an issue Do you believe that the Biden administration delivered on student debt, that could be a turning point?
Without a doubt. I mean, in our research, we found that over 75% of current college students would be more likely to vote in the midterms election if there was cancellation of any student debt, not to say if the student debt was canceled completely. And education reform in general is something that young voters care a lot about. I remember when Joe Biden was first running, his agenda included free college for a lot of people, and that just got left in the sidelines when Build Back Better was being negotiated. But yes, absolutely, if the student debt was canceled, there would be so much energy behind supporting Democrats in the midterms, and it's simply a strategic failure not to do that if they don't.